Hi ladies, if you remember last week when we left off, we had been discussing natural selection, this idea that natural selection acts on individuals and then evolution acts on populations. From there we had talked about different types of selection, specifically directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So having talked about those, now we want to talk about another evolutionary phenomena called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a random change in allele frequency caused by chance occurrences. And I think the key here is just to remember that this is, in fact, random. Similar to this idea of evolution in general, it is a change in allele frequency, so we're seeing some kind of change in characteristics in the population. However, this frequency change is strictly due to random events. And then if we take a look at examples of genetic drift or things that could cause genetic drift, that would be things like natural disasters. One thing that I would point out is that when we have something happen to a population, some kind of random change in that allele frequency, the surviving gene pool may not be the same as the original. It may look significantly different. And when we talk about those differences, we are talking specifically about those differences in allele frequencies. So when we talked before about this idea of natural selection, it was this idea that if an organism had certain traits that made them more successful, and then those three things that we keep repeating kind of over and over again, better able to survive, reproduce, and pass on traits. Now, here's a little bit different. These changes in alleles, there's no evolutionary benefit. We just see them occurring more frequently in the population because of where certain organisms happen to be when natural disaster struck. So what I'd like to do then is take a look at two examples or two types of genetic drift. The very first one is going to be called bottleneck. Bottleneck, I thought it would be entertaining to draw a nice little bottle to help you remember. So when we look at the bottleneck effect, it's a change in allele frequency following drastic reduction in population size. So if we have some kind of natural disaster that wipes out a significant number of individuals in the population, that population is reduced by a large number, then the surviving gene pool may look drastically different than the original population. A good example of this would be the cheetah population, and I know I've used them for other examples, but cheetahs, there's very few of them in the world. They're endangered. They had a drastic decrease in their population size, and as a result, they have very, very little genetic variation. So it actually stands to reason that many endangered species actually deal with this bottleneck effect. If we were to take a look at what this might look like, I think it would be easier to think about it in terms of a storyboard. So for example, maybe we have two alleles that we're going to focus on in a population. We have our organisms that display the red allele, and then organisms that display the second, which is an orange allele. Okay, relatively good population size. Let's say that some kind of natural disaster strikes. Okay, from storyboard 1 to 2, something happens. It doesn't actually really matter what that is. However, the surviving organisms only have the red allele. Now, if you have these organisms mating, chances are you're going to end up with a population that looks very similar to those organisms that were able to survive. I would point out that this is not natural selection. This particular trait did not help the population survive, reproduce, and pass on that trait. They happen to survive purely out of chance. Next type that I would like to talk about is going to be founder effects. Whenever I think of founder effect, I always think of the Mayflower and Pilgrims. I don't know, maybe it's just because it's that time of year. You get a little boat action. Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And they came over to settle a new location, taking over that area, colonizing it, kind of making it their own, right? So we will be taking a look then at founder effect. Now, in this case, genetic drift may occur when few individuals colonize a new habitat. And then this change in allele frequency is due to migration of a small subgroup. And I would be really careful here too. When I say migration, really I mean like kind of a permanent migration. So really it's more of an immigration action here. And it's a small subgroup of individuals. So a really good example of this then would be like the wolves of Yellowstone. Now we ended up moving those on purpose, and that actually had a lot of different ecological impacts. However, that was a really small group of organisms, and there is a very specific set of traits that we see in wolf populations in Yellowstone, primarily because we were essentially messing with which organisms went into that population to begin with. So in this case, maybe here again, we have two alleles. Let's say we have red and blue. And then from storyboard 1 to 2, in this case, for different various reasons, these organisms are the ones that are going to colonize a new area. So they're generally being forced out of whatever area they're in due to some kind of natural disaster, or they're being split off from the original population because of that natural disaster. And as a result, this new colony, this new group that they're founding, is going to have limited number of alleles and does not reflect what the original population looked like. Certain alleles get lost. So there's genetic drift. This is something that we discuss when we talk about changes in allele frequency, keeping in mind that this is actually not natural selection at work, simply because it is that random change in allele frequency, whereas natural selection is actually selecting for specific alleles that give an advantage.